and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. President Donald Trump will meet Qatar's Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani to discuss a US-backed Gaza ceasefire plan, including a 60-day truce, hostage release, and Israeli troop withdrawals, according to media reports. The US President Donald Trump has called on the Justice Department to release all credible information from its probe into Jeffrey Epstein amid growing outrage from his MAGA base over alleged cover-ups. Trump, who once promised to reveal Epstein files, now claims the case is boring stuff. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump has announced a trade deal with Indonesia imposing a 19% tariff down from a threatened 32% earlier. It was finalized after talks with Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto, and this deal now includes $15 billion in US energy, $4.5 billion in agriculture, and 50 Boeing jets. China's Vice Premier He Daifeng has warned that the world is facing turbulence and transformation as he opened a Beijing expo today, where NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang is also expected to speak. According to media reports, Vice Premier also criticized certain countries for interfering in the market through tariffs and other measures. The European Union is practice of importing sustainable aviation fuel to meet emissions targets is being criticized by the International Air Transport Association for undermining environmental goals. IATA says transporting green fuel from outside Europe actually increases its carbon footprint, making the strategy counterproductive. A Brazilian prosecutor has urged the Supreme Court to find former President Jair Bolsonaro guilty of plotting a coup, marking a major turning point in the high-profile trial. The case gained international attention after US President Donald Trump attempted to defend Bolsonaro. A volcano in southwest Iceland has erupted for the 12th time since 2021 as part of an ongoing series of fissure eruptions on the Reykjanes Peninsula, according to Iceland's meteorological office, while the experts warned the activity could continue for decades. Cuba's Labor Minister Marta Elena Feito resigned after public outrage over her claim that people eating from trash cans were disguised as beggars, a statement criticized by President Miguel Diaz-Canel for showing a lack of sensitivity, as Cuba now faces its worst economic crisis in 3 decades, with 350,000 people in vulnerable conditions. As trade talks with the US remain uncertain, the European Commission is preparing to target up to approximately $84 billion worth of American goods for potential tariffs. The EU's proposed list includes high-profile US exports such as Boeing aircraft, bourbon whiskey, and cars. The move comes in response to President Donald Trump's latest threat to impose a 30% tariff on imports from the EU starting August 1st. European officials have warned that such a measure would be unacceptable and could effectively end normal trade relations between the two major economies. According to reports, the EU's retaliation plan predates Trump's latest comments and was originally a response to existing US duties on cars, car parts, and a 10% baseline tariff. The broader EU package also targets American exports across multiple sectors, including chemicals, medical devices, and precision electronics, as well as food and agriculture products valued at over 6.3 billion euros. These include a wide range of fruits, vegetables, wine, beer, and spirits. Here's what the US president had to say on a trade deal with the European Union. Now we move on to our next news. US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has said that he had launched an investigation into Brazil's unfair trading practices a week after President Donald Trump threatened a 50% tariff on imports from Latin America's largest economy. According to Greer, the United States Trade Representative investigation will decide if Brazil's treatment of digital trade and preferential tariffs, among the others, is unreasonable or discriminatory, and burdens or restricts U.S. commerce. Meanwhile, Brazil has said that the 50% U.S. tariffs on Brazil are unfair and that they will work to get the U.S. to reverse tariffs on Brazilian goods before they are set to take effect on August 1st, as per Vice President Geraldo Alckmin. Alckmin has said that the government aims to resolve the issue as quickly as possible. Here's what the Brazilian vice president had to say. Now we move on to our next news. At the opening of the Beijing Expo, Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng remarked that the world is experiencing a period of turbulence and transformation amid what he described as increasing economic risk and uncertainty. Speaking at the event, he directly criticized countries imposing trade restrictions, saying that some were interfering in the market under the pretext of reducing risk by implementing tariffs and other barriers. His comments come as U.S. President Donald Trump announced trade deals and new tariffs on several countries, including Indonesia and Vietnam. Trump also signaled a fresh round of tariff notifications and said letters outlining new U.S. tariff rates for smaller countries would be sent out soon, with the proposed rate expected to be slightly over 10%. Here's what the Chinese Vice Premier had to say.
当前，一些国家以去风险为由干预市场，以加征关税和限制措施等手段搞所谓的制造业回流，产业链、供应链的重复建设增多，拉低了全球经济整体的运行。
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has said that she disagrees with the U.S. government's decision to impose a duty of about 17% on Mexican tomato imports. Speaking at her regular morning news conference, Sheinbaum also said she hoped to announce measures next week in conjunction with tomato producers related to Washington's announcement on July 14th that will begin charging a duty of about 17% on imports of fresh tomatoes from Mexico. Measures next week in conjunction with tomato producers related to Washington's announcement on July 14th that will begin charging a duty of about 17% on imports of fresh tomatoes from Mexico. The Mexican president also said Mexico will take action if an agreement with Washington regarding new tariffs is not reached by the August 1st deadline, set by her U.S. counterpart Donald Trump. This comes after Trump on July 12th threatened to impose a 30% tariff on imports from Mexico starting on August 1st, claiming the United States' top trading partner had not done enough to stop drug cartels. Now we move on to our next news. President Vladimir Putin remains resolute in his commitment to continuing Russia's military actions in Ukraine, with sources close to the Kremlin indicating that he undeterred by threats from U.S. President Donald Trump. Putin reportedly believes that Russia's economy and military are capable of withstanding additional Western sanctions, and he intends to pursue peace on his own terms. These terms include demands for NATO to cease its eastward expansion, for Ukraine to adopt a neutral stance, and for international recognition of Russia's territorial gains. As Russian forces continue to make progress on the ground, there are indications that Putin's desire for further territorial acquisition may intensify. Some sources suggest that should Ukraine's defenses weaken, Putin may seek to push deeper into Ukrainian territory. Now we are joined for this discussion by Stefan Nagy. He's a professor at International Christian University. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today. Good to see you. How does President Putin's insistence on pursuing peace only on his terms, including demands on NATO and Ukraine's neutrality, shape the prospects for any diplomatic resolution into this conflict?
Well, President Putin's positions on Ukraine have really not changed since 2014. The Crimean Peninsula was taken over by Russia, and after the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, we've seen a continued and consistent approach to the maximalist demands when it comes to Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's bottom line is that Ukraine will not be an independent state or will be a broken state. Vladimir Putin's bottom line is that Ukraine cannot exist within NATO or likely within the European Union, and that it must submit to Russian influence. This has not changed. He continues to pursue this approach, and he does this with support from other authoritarian regimes like China.
And Stefan, given Putin's confidence in Russia's ability to withstand further Western sanctions, is it realistic, and what does this signal about the effectiveness of current international economic pressures on Russia that's already present?
Well, ultimately, the sanctions don't hurt the elite, they hurt the ordinary Russian people. And the question for Putin and the elites is how much pain can ordinary Russians feel? This is the real challenge. I think this is the real question is how long can ordinary Russians do without medicine, do without using the international financial system, without being able to travel abroad, study abroad. These are real challenges for Russia. Not to mention, I think the Trump administration's proclaimed willingness to have 100% tariffs on countries that trade with Russia. This could very negatively impact Russia, and I think that we're going to have to play a wait-and-see game if the Russian regime is really willing to succumb to this kind of pain and put its people through this kind of economic challenge. And at this stage, I don't think anybody really knows. That's really up to the Russian elite that have pursued this whole aggression.
Thank you for sharing that, Professor. Now, please stay with us as we stay on this topic. The European Union failed to approve its 18th sanctions package against Russia during a meeting of EU foreign ministers on Tuesday. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas expressed disappointment over the setback. Let's listen in to what. Well, we skip the bite and we move on. Slovakia has been blocking the sanctions package, demanding assurances regarding a separate proposal to phase out Russian gas imports by 2028. As discussions continue, Slovakia's objections remain a major roadblock in the EU's efforts to impose further penalties on Russia. Meanwhile, German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul also voiced confidence that the EU would soon adopt a new sanctions package targeting Russia. In a joint press conference, he expressed optimism that the bloc would overcome current hurdles. He added that the sanctions would likely be coupled with additional measures from the United States. In addition to the ongoing sanctions discussions, EU foreign ministers are set to address the issue of frozen Russian assets during an informal meeting scheduled for the end of August. Let's listen in to what Kaja Kallas has said.
We have very different views on the frozen assets between the member states. So we have agreed to have a discussion on frozen assets only in the Gimnich format that we have in August with the ministers.
Now we go back to our guest discussion with Stefan Nagy. He's a professor at International Christian University. Thank you, Stefan, for staying with us. Now, why is Slovakia siding with Russia? What are the factors that are contributing to its stopping of EU's policies against Russia?
Well, like most Central European states, they're not siding with Russia, they're siding with their own national interests. National interests for Slovakia and other Central European countries is really energy security. Their economies have been inundated by the downward pressure that is associated with more expensive energy costs associated with the war. And as a result, they're making choices that are trying to, ensure that the European Union makes decisions that don't further negatively impact their economies. I don't think this is brain surgery. It's actually quite realistic. And many countries have been faced with downward pressure on their economies because of the increased cost of energy. Inflation is a real problem in Central Europe, and until the war is finished, I think that inflation will continue to be a critical challenge for Slovakia, but also other states within the region.
Thank you, Stefan, for sharing, Professor Stefan, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has warned that countries like Brazil, China, and India could face severe secondary sanctions if they continue doing business with Russia. The warning comes after US President Donald Trump announced new weapons for Ukraine and threatened 100% tariffs on buyers of Russian exports unless a peace deal is reached within 50 days. Let's listen in to his comments.
With that sanctions bill saying, listen, if you are the president of China or the prime minister of India or the president of Brazil and you're still trading with the Russians and getting the oil and the gas in, and you sometimes even resell it for a higher price, know that if this guy in Moscow doesn't get serious about peace talks, I will slam secondary sanctions on you of 100%. So I'm sure they don't know yet what hit them. This will take some time to sink in, and I think you guys making this clear in the media, the senators maybe also discussing this with their counterparts in Brazil, India, China, will be very helpful to put maximum pressure on Russia in addition to the weapons delivery into Ukraine.
Now we go back to our discussion with Professor Stefan Nagy. Thank you, Professor, for staying with us. Now, what are the geopolitical implications of NATO's warning to countries like Brazil, China, as well as India about potential secondary sanctions for continuing business with Russia?
Well, I think actually ultimately it's unrealistic to ask Brazil, India, or China to cease their engagements with Russia. Russia provides cheap energy for different reasons. They have long-standing relationships. And I think that each case that you've mentioned has different interests in maintaining their relationship with Russia. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, China has enjoyed cheap energy imports from Russia. They see that moving away from that relationship would put them in a very difficult position vis-a-vis their real competitor, the United States. India has long-standing relations with Russia, with the former Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union supported India through much of its non-alignment movement history, and by providing arms, providing energy. They're reticent to throw away a friend that provided that kind of support. And again, Brazil requires cheap energy to keep its economy going. So each state has different reasons for maintaining this relationship, and that's not going to change. What these kinds of threats or demands actually do is I think that they push these countries in the corner, and it forces them to make not the choice that NATO and other members would like, but other choices to work together to push back against these kinds of threats. And that, in that sense, they're counterproductive, and they're not engaged in the actual challenges of stopping Russia from its war on Ukraine.
And in the context of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, what challenges do these sanctions pose to global diplomacy and efforts to achieve a peace deal within the ambitious 50-day timeline?
Well, if you remember, Mr. Trump, President Trump said he'd end the war in one day, and I think that was about as realistic as the 50-day extension that has been placed on Russia by, again, trying to cajole or push countries, whether it's China, India, or others, into a corner where they cut off their relationship with Russia is extremely unrealistic, and they're not going to do it. They have interest in Russia because they have interest in Russia and its international interests. Can we find off-ramps in terms of diplomacy and moving forward? Well, this requires work coming together, having these diplomatic discussions behind closed doors, and making those hard compromises on all sides. Is that realistic? I don't think so at this particular stage. India is continuing to invest in a multipolar world and multi-alignment. China is very concerned about its strategic competition with the United States and what it would mean if the United States could concentrate all its resources just on China rather than China and Russia. And those countries in the global south, to be realistic, they require energy, they require food, and they require partners to deal with and advocate for the issues that the global south or these developing countries are focused on, which is development, stability, and getting technology, and working towards recalibrating the international system so it functions better.
Thank you very much, Professor Stefan Nagy, for joining us today and sharing your insight. Now we move on to our next news. Reportedly, U.S. President Donald Trump will meet Qatar's Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani today to discuss negotiations over a Gaza ceasefire deal. This comes as Israeli and Hamas negotiators have been taking part in ceasefire talks in Doha since July the 6th, discussing an American-backed proposal for a 60-day ceasefire involving hostage releases, Israeli troop withdrawals, and talks on ending this conflict. These talks also come amid divisions over the extent of an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Now we're joined by Peter Baum. He's a foreign editor of Weekly Blitz, joining us live from London. Thank you, Peter, for joining us today. Good to see you.
Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you. Given the complexities and divisions over the extent of Israeli troop withdrawals, how realistic is the proposed 60-day ceasefire, and what challenges do you think still remain for achieving a durable peace?
Okay. Well, about 3 or 4 days ago, I think President Trump made a statement suggesting that we were no more than 2 weeks away from a permanent ceasefire. Apparently, Hamas were quite positive on the Witkoff plan, and the Israelis responded, and out of 5 elements, there were 4 had been agreed and 1 hadn't, and I think that 1 element was the area from which Israeli troops would withdraw. Israel then submitted another proposal, a roadmap, as they call it, and as far as I'm aware from my sources, this current roadmap is being discussed amongst the interested parties in Doha. If that can be agreed, then the chances of a 60-day ceasefire are very realistic. But we've been here many times before, only to be disappointed. So we'll have to wait and see. But I understand that Witkoff, Trump's chief negotiator in the talks, is putting both parties under severe pressure to come to a solution which will include the Israeli view of where her troops should withdraw to. So we've got another couple of days yet. For the first time, I'm actually relatively hopeful that something will come of this, whereas in previous ceasefire talks, I haven't had that hope.
Peter, can you tell us more about why are you more hopeful for this upcoming talks? How might President Trump's involvement or meeting with Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani influence the prospects for a lasting ceasefire?
Yes, indeed. I think one of the main reasons why I'm hopeful is because Netanyahu is under severe pressure domestically from those in Israel who are frankly too tired to continue with this conflict. The hostages have not been released, and Hamas, though severely dented, has not been 100% defeated. Also, Netanyahu is facing pressure from within his own government, who may create the scenario where the government is brought down. So I think from the Israeli perspective, given the pressure that the Trump administration are putting on them, and given the domestic turmoil that they're currently facing from the general public and from within the coalition, I think that Netanyahu will have to agree for the ceasefire. Now, as far as the other side are concerned, Hamas, there is no doubt about it that politically, militarily, financially, they have been severely dented to the extent that they will no longer pose the kind of military threat that they posed to Israel pre-October the 7th. And the Gazans themselves want peace. They do not want Hamas to continue with this conflict. And as we've seen and from previous interviews I've had with you, there are elements within Gaza, family clans, that are actually now opposing Hamas, fighting with them, vying for power, of course, we understand that. But both sides are sick of the conflict and the pressures being put on both sides by the Qataris on Hamas, by the Trump administration on Netanyahu, and both Hamas and the Netanyahu government having internal domestic conflicts to contend with, I think will ensure that this ceasefire has the best possible opportunity of succeeding.
And Peter, how might the divisions, you've kind of already touched on this a little bit, but how might the divisions within Israel currently about the extent of troop withdrawals, also about the support towards the current regime, affect in or play in Doha, and what challenges does this pose for reaching sustainable peace agreement for Netanyahu?
Okay, so let's be a little bit more detailed about this. For those of us that follow this situation 24/7, we know that hour by hour, day by day, protests in Israel against the conflict for the release of the hostages is ongoing and building momentum. There is no doubt about that. Ironically, Netanyahu, his support from the polls we've seen, has support for him personally has increased because of the way he's handled the conflicts, not only with Hamas, but with Syria, with Lebanon, and with the Houthis. So his personal polling is going up. But those within his administration, let's say call them the extreme right, the finance minister, for example, and others, are intent on continuing the conflict until Hamas are further defeated, let's say. Now, those pressures cannot be withstood for too much longer. So either the Netanyahu government falls, or the right wing fall in line, and the Netanyahu government continues, but it's the Trump administration and the pressures that they are putting on the Netanyahu government that will determine the outcome. Donald Trump's administration is the mover and shaker in all this, and although the recent meeting between Netanyahu and Trump gave the Netanyahu government a little bit more time to finish the job, let's say, Donald Trump's patience will be wearing thin, and he will want Mr. Witkoff to bring an end to the conflict and impose the 60-day ceasefire that we hope will come about from this.
Yes, indeed. Peter, thank you for sharing that. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic. Malnutrition rates among children in the Gaza Strip have doubled since Israel sharply restricted food entry in March. The United Nations has said UNRWA reported 10.2% of children under 5 were acutely malnourished in June, up from 5.5% in March. The malnutrition spike comes as Israeli strikes killed 93 Palestinians in the last 24 hours on Tuesday, including women and children, according to Gaza's health ministry. The Israeli military has not commented on these strikes. These attacks come amid a deadlock in ceasefire talks while humanitarian aid remains severely limited in the enclave. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Peter Baum, foreign editor of Weekly Blitz. Thank you, Peter, for staying with us. Now, what is your reaction on this news that is coming out with reports from UNRWA as well?
Well, if they're true, then clearly they are shocking. But I put a caveat, as most impartial commentators do, to the statistical information emanating from those NGOs associated with the United Nations, previously responsible for providing aid and assistance to the Palestinians. Now, UNRWA, for decades, has been, let's say, not a fair or impartial aid organisation. It has had people within the organisation that are clearly operating with Hamas, and therefore the Israelis haven't trusted UNRWA for decades. And UNRWA is seeing its powers diminish day by day as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is taking over those obligations that UNRWA were previously responsible for. So there is a, what should I say, UNRWA have an objective in promoting this information, much of it false, statistical information about malnutrition rates, etc., etc. On the other side of this, we know that the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, is providing and has been providing over 1 million meals to Gaza each day for the last several weeks, and in fact has upped its output very recently from just over 1 million to nearer 1.5 million meals a day. So they are doing, in my opinion, what seems to be a pretty reasonable job given the circumstances. And you would have thought, would you not, that rather than criticise this aid organisation that is trying its best to provide meals for the Gazans, you'd have thought that other organisations who supposedly have the well-being of Gazans at the heart of what they're trying to do would be fully supportive of the GHF, but in fact they're not. They're trying to demonise it, they're trying to discredit it, and they're trying everything in their power to ensure that they remain the organisations responsible for Palestinian well-being, whereas the Israelis and the Trump administration are saying, no, we're no longer having you there, you've just facilitated the conflict, you've ensured that people working for you have enriched themselves, and we no longer trust you. So again, the statistics emanating from UNRWA, I believe, should not be taken as being wholly truthful. If malnutrition rates are going up, then of course that's shocking, but the information, if that we're receiving about the food deliveries and aid deliveries would contradict that. So let's see in the days ahead how this propaganda war plays out from the one side and how the objectives of the other side ensure that the statistics are true or false. I think it's too early to say, but I think that the GHF are actually on an upward trajectory in achieving their objectives, whereas UNRWA, I'm afraid, are on a downward trajectory in trying to maintain their power base within the area.
And building on that, in your view, what responsibilities do international actors have in addressing the worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and how might this impact future diplomatic efforts in the region?
Yeah, international actors. I think the United Nations has been termed the theatre of the absurd. So if they're the international actors, I don't think the United Nations have much credibility in this. The real crux of the matter will be post-ceasefire and how those international actors behave during what we spoke about earlier, the 60-day ceasefire. I think there will always be those who will be taking a pro-Palestinian, let's say anti-Jewish state side, and there will always be those more pragmatic that want to see both parties come to an agreement, and there will be those that will always take a pro-Israel side. So the international actors, as we call them, will do according to what their domestic political ideologies are, and the people who have suffered, the Palestinians and the Israelis, probably will be in a better place, but there will still be those who have every reason to continue facilitating the conflict.
Thank you very much, Peter, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we stay on the topic. An Israeli scheme to move hundreds of thousands of already uprooted Palestinians to a so-called humanitarian city in an Israeli military-controlled part of southern Gaza has drawn widespread criticism. However, officials have said that a practical plan has yet to be crafted. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government has defended the project. The idea was publicly floated by Defense Minister Israel Katz earlier this month. Katz says that the city to be built on the ruins of Rafah would house 600,000 Palestinians after screening out Hamas members. This move has also sparked criticism from the UN, with the UN spokesperson Stephane Dujarric saying that the UN rejects any forced displacement. Netanyahu rejected an initial draft as too expensive and ordered a cheaper version. The plan remains in early stages amid widespread international concern. An Israeli scheme to move hundreds of thousands of already uprooted Palestinians to a so-called humanitarian city in an Israeli military-controlled part of southern Gaza has drawn widespread criticism. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Peter Baum. He's a foreign editor at Weekly Blitz. Thank you, Peter, for staying with us. Now, how does this sharp rise in criticism or the hinting of this plan by Israel tell us, is this realistic? Do you think that we will see this plan maybe take place in real life?
Let's take the first question about criticism, and it really goes back to the previous issue we were talking about, the aid being put into the Gazans. those same international players that we were talking about were criticising the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Why? Because it's an Israeli-American proposal, an organisation. These same international actors, the UN, are again criticising Israel regarding this proposal about a new city being built. But let's be totally, and we could have, I could have told you that even before the proposal was going to be proposed, because the UN will undoubtedly, by weight of numbers, continue to criticise anything Israel does. That goes without saying. But let's be a little bit realistic. It's clear that Gaza will have to be reconstructed. There is no doubt about that. And I believe that Donald Trump will be the main player during this reconstruction episode. So, where is the money going to come from? Well, I think those previous players that supported the Palestinians will still have a role to play, such as the Qataris, etc. But the Iranians will be out the picture. There will be no Iranian influence in this. So Gaza will definitely have to be reconstructed. Where and how that reconstruction is going to take place will definitely have one significant point to it, and that will be that Israel will no longer tolerate a hostile Palestinian or Gazan entity right on its border as it did before. So there will be, let's call it a demilitarized zone that will be an area the two parties will have to live with, and the Gazans themselves will probably have a say, but not as big a say as the Americans and the Israelis and the Qataris, who are going to be responsible for the reconstruction. Irrespective of that, it will mean movement of Gazans from areas they previously lived in, right on Israel's borders, to other areas. And of course, the UN will call that ethnic cleansing or displacement of people, because they cannot bear to see a Trump-Israeli united front that will actually may have some benefits to the poor people of Gazans who have suffered so much. All the UN want to do, and the power blocks within the UN, is want to ensure that Trump and Israel will continue to be demonized, and they're putting the Gazans in the middle of that and using them as their tool to weaponize their perverse ideology.
Thank you, Peter, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we move on to our next news. Reportedly, U.S. President Donald Trump will meet Qatar's Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani today to also discuss efforts to resume negotiations between U.S. and Iran in order to reach a new nuclear agreement. This comes as Iran has said that there won't be any nuclear talks with the U.S. if it insists on Iran stopping its nuclear enrichment. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Peter Baum. Peter, thank you for staying with us. Now, what role might Qatar play as a mediator in efforts to restart U.S.-Iran nuclear talks? And how could President Trump's meeting with the Sheikh impact these delicate negotiations?
Yeah, Qatar will have a very important role in these talks as a mediator. You see, I think we're all of the view now that Iran suffered devastating blows to their nuclear ambitions. And even as we talk, over the last few days, there have been a number of unexplained explosions in various Iranian cities. Now, we're not sure whether these are coming from, as we suppose they're coming, from internal Iranian opposition, or whether there are still Mossad assets and operatives operating within Iran. So Iran is under huge pressure to negotiate if the totalitarian theocracy wants to retain power. So, going back to your question, I think the Qatari influence will be significant. I think Iranians themselves, both domestically and ironically within the Iranian government, despite their bluster, wish to come to some agreement, because at the end of the day, retaining power is all that the Khamenei regime want to do. If they come to the negotiating table, there is a much better chance of them retaining power than if they continue being negative and, let's say, restarting the conflict. So, yes, I think Qatar will have an influence, a great influence on Khamenei.
Thank you very much, Peter, for sharing that insight and staying with us throughout our news. Now we move on to our next news. NVIDIA is preparing to resume sales of its H20 artificial intelligence chips to China, a move linked to ongoing U.S. trade negotiations involving rare earth elements. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has confirmed that the planned resumption is part of a broader agreement. The announcement comes just days after NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang met with U.S. President Donald Trump. NVIDIA stated on Monday that it has applied for licenses to resume shipments of the H20 GPU to China and has received assurances from U.S. officials that the licenses will be granted soon. Here's what NVIDIA CEO had to say.
I'm announcing that the U.S. government has approved for us filing licenses to start shipping H20s. We will start to sell H20s to the Chinese market, and I'm looking forward to shipping H20s very soon. And so I'm very happy with that very, very good news.
Now we are joined by our guest, Andrew K.P. Long, for this discussion as a China strategist. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us today. Good to see you. What are the strategic implications of the U.S. allowing NVIDIA to resume sales of these chips to China, especially amid ongoing trade negotiations with China, U.S.?
First of all, NVIDIA is, of course,
Andrew, there might be an audio, some technical issue there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now it's perfect. Please, could you
All
start
right.
it? Okay, thank
All
you.
right. There are a number of issues here. First of all, NVIDIA is the United States' largest company by capitalization, but is also a leader in technology, especially in high-end chips, selling not only within the United States, but around the world, is in fact controls the patents to these high-end chips of the world. So it's of great importance to the economy, to the American financial system. Now, but the biggest buyer of these chips is China. But on the other hand, the other dimension is, of course, these chips military applications. So the United States is extremely careful to allow China to acquire the technology, hence all these restrictions on China's access high-end chips, high-end being defined as 3 nanometers and below. So these are minute chips, which NVIDIA has the capacity. Now, this solution of selling a special kind of chip called H20 is specially catering for the China market. It may satisfy China's demand for this chip for the time being, as China trying to develop its own capabilities, but also it stops short of giving China the kind of technology that may have military applications. So that's what we're seeing now. Now, the other dimension, of course, this comes at a time when China is hosting a supply chain inclusiveness as a response to a wrecking ball imposed by Americans indiscriminate tariffs left, right, and center. This obviously upends the whole world supply and value chain, and China is at the center of that, and it affects not only China, but of all other countries. So I think that this is also a narrative of this conference, promoting supply chain integrity, enabling the free flow of components and also products across the world, and then supplying China with the chips China needs at the moment without giving China the kind of capabilities or technologies which could have military application.
And please, Andrew, thank you for sharing that, and stay with us as we stay on this topic. In a related development, NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang is visiting Beijing to attend China's Supply Chain Expo. Speaking at China's Supply Chain Expo in Beijing, NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang expressed optimism about ongoing US-China discussions. He praised China's rapid advancements in artificial intelligence during his visit, describing the Chinese market as both large and dynamic. Let's listen in to what he had to say.
China's open source AI is a catalyst for global progress, giving every country and industry a chance to join the AI revolution.
Now we are joined by guest Andrew K.P. Long. He's a China strategist joining us live from London. Now, Andrew, what does NVIDIA's engagement in China's supply chain ecosystem indicate about the evolving dynamics of global technology amid geopolitical tensions?
Of course, he's referring to AI. AI, of course, is the defining technology of this era. It cuts across the way businesses are done. It cuts across how research is carried out, not only in academia, but in other areas. And it introduces different kinds of way of doing businesses and also new products. And of course, China's DeepSeek technology relies on open source platforms and also requires much less energy input because the initial AI recent development requires a great deal of data centers, which involve huge investments because these data centers are high intensity energy clusters. And also they have to be located in special spots in the world where energy supplies are abundant and cost great deal of money. But whereas DeepSeek, the China recent model, upends the scale, requiring a lot less energy and coming up with a kind of model that could be equally good, if not even better. So I think that this is a revolutionary challenge. And of course, there is a great deal of opportunities for both sides of the technology divide to cooperate. And that's what the leader's chairman was referring to. And then, of course, compatible with what China has been promoting, a more interconnected, a more interdependent world. And both sides need to cooperate, even if both sides continue to compete. So I think that that's what's happening, especially in the new technology like the artificial intelligence.
And Andrew, you already also mentioned, but can you tell us more about how significant is Jensen Huang's visit to Beijing and his positive remarks about China's AI advancements for the future of US-China tech cooperation and competition?
Well, he is the leader of the U.S. chip technology. And of course, he's got Chinese roots. And then most of his business is linked with China, at least over the supply chain. So I think that it would blow a big hole in his bottom line if he tries to decouple entirely from China. And at a time when China is promoting a more inclusive world, so he is obviously a very influential person, and time when the whole world shifts, contest between segregation, decoupling, but also cooperation and integration. So I think that this is a right time for someone like him, and also this forum in China, to address these issues. And indeed, I think even President Trump sees that it's not possible entirely to decouple from China, even though he continues to put pressure to contain China's rise. So it's a kind of not a black and white kind of solution, but it's a mixture, involving both cooperation and competition.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us today and sharing your insight as China strategist. Now we move on to our next news. Let's now look at the news coming from the world of business. ASML, the world's largest supplier of computer chip-making equipment, has warned it may not grow in 2026, despite second quarter bookings beating expectations. The Dutch company reported net bookings of 5.54 billion euros, well above analyst estimates of 4.44 billion. CEO Christophe Fouquet said geopolitical and economic uncertainty continues to cloud the outlook, tempering hopes that the strong quarter would ease worries over future demand. UBS has rehired Masazumi Toriyama to lead its global banking division in Japan, confirming the move today. Moriyama, who previously spent 18 years at UBS, will start August 4th, replacing interim head Yasunori Saku, who becomes chairman. UBS plans to expand the unit by 50% as foreign banks boost investment banking in Japan amid a wave of deal-making. Earlier this month, Citigroup also made senior hires to strengthen its Japan operation. Asian stock markets fell while the dollar climbed to its strongest against the yen since April. After U.S. inflation data showed tariffs are driving prices higher, Treasury yields rose to a one-month high, fueling dollar gains. U.S. consumer prices posted their biggest monthly increase since January, with economists pointing to Trump's escalating import tariffs. The data has tempered expectations that the Federal Reserve will cut rates soon. Major minnower BHP has said it is too expensive for Australia to build a green iron industry, even after Australia and China agreed to work together to decarbonize the steel supply chain. BHP Australia Chief Geraldine Slattery said costs would be double those in the Middle East or China, even with policy support. The company said its strategy is not to produce green iron or steel itself, highlighting the challenges for Australia's green steel ambitions. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.